My ex left me for someone richer. Karma struck hard. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Rachel Turner. I am 29 years old and I live in Chicago, Illinois, a city filled with busy streets, tall buildings, and people chasing different versions of success. My story began several years ago when I was in a relationship with a man named Mark. At the time, I truly believed we were building a future together. We met during a casual gathering through mutual friends, and what started as simple conversations quickly turned into something deeper. Mark was confident, charming, and ambitious, and I admired how determined he seemed to create a successful life for himself. During the early years of our relationship, everything felt balanced. We supported each other through work challenges, celebrated small achievements, and talked often about the future we imagined one day, living in a comfortable home, building stable careers, and eventually starting a family. Our plans were never focused on luxury or status, but rather on the idea of creating a peaceful life through effort, loyalty, and patience. However, as time passed, I slowly noticed small changes in the way Mark talked about success. His conversations began shifting toward money, influence, and the kind of lifestyle that comes with wealth. At first, I thought it was simply natural ambition. Many people dream about financial security and a better future, but the more he talked about these things, the more I realized that his priorities were changing. He began paying closer attention to people who had connections, expensive lifestyles, and opportunities that seemed to promise faster success than the steady path we had once imagined together. During this time, I continued focusing on my work, building experience, and improving my career step by step. My goals were always based on long-term stability rather than sudden success. But Mark started describing my approach as too slow, too cautious, and lacking the excitement he believed life should have. I tried to understand his perspective because relationships require compromise. Yet deep down, I felt the difference between our values growing larger with every passing month. The turning point came during a quiet evening when he asked to meet and talk about our future. The conversation felt different from the start because his tone carried a strange mixture of confidence and distance. He explained that he had recently met someone whose lifestyle and opportunities were very different from ours. This person came from a wealthy family and lived in a world filled with luxury, connections, and possibilities that Mark believed could open doors he had always wanted to walk through. Listening to him describe this new relationship felt surreal because the man who once spoke about building a life through shared effort was now describing a future built around wealth and status. He eventually admitted that he had decided to pursue that new life and that continuing our relationship would only hold him back from the opportunities he believed were waiting for him. Hearing those words left me frozen in a moment of disbelief because everything we had built together suddenly seemed to vanish in front of me. The years of shared memories, the plans we once discussed, and the trust I believed defined our relationship all felt replaced by a decision driven entirely by ambition and the promise of a richer life. Mark spoke as if his choice was logical, explaining that sometimes people must choose the path that leads to greater success, even if it means leaving something familiar behind. He believed that one day I would understand why he made that decision, and that eventually I would see that he had simply chosen the better life. After saying those words, he walked away with a confidence that suggested he had no doubt about the future he had chosen. I remained standing there, trying to process the sudden emptiness left behind by a relationship I once believed would last for many years. The city around me continued moving with its usual energy, cars passing, people walking, and lights glowing in the distance. Yet in that moment, everything felt strangely quiet inside my mind. The person who once promised to build a life beside me had chosen wealth and status instead, leaving me alone to face the reality that sometimes the people we trust the most can walk away when something they believe is better appears. And as painful as that realization was, it marked the beginning of a chapter in my life that would eventually show me that success and happiness are rarely defined by the things people chase when they choose money over loyalty. The weeks after Mark left were some of the quietest and most confusing moments of my life because when a long relationship suddenly ends, it feels as if the routine you once depended on disappears overnight. Chicago continued moving with its usual fast energy, people rushing to work, trains passing through the city streets filled with noise and movement, yet inside my own world everything felt strangely slow and uncertain. The apartment that once held shared plans and conversations now felt empty, and every small detail reminded me of the future I once believed we were building together. At first, the hardest part was not the breakup itself, but the way it happened, knowing that someone I trusted had chosen a different life simply because it looked richer and more exciting forced me to question many things about the relationship we had shared. However, instead of allowing that pain to define my direction, I slowly began focusing on the one thing that had always remained steady in my life. My work, my career had always been built on patience and dedication, and now it became the place where I could put my energy while rebuilding my confidence. I started spending more time learning new skills, taking additional responsibilities, and improving the projects I was involved in at work. The long hours were exhausting at times, but they helped me replace the constant memories of the past with a sense of purpose. Each day I reminded myself that stability and independence were not weaknesses but strengths that would eventually shape a better future. During this period, I also began spending more time with friends who supported me through the difficult transition. Their encouragement helped me realize that losing someone who valued money more than loyalty was not a reflection of my worth, but rather a reflection of the priorities he had chosen. Meanwhile, Mark seemed to be living the life he once described through social media updates. I occasionally saw glimpses of the world he had stepped into: photographs from expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and gatherings that appeared glamorous and effortless. The images showed a lifestyle filled with wealth and comfort, and for a brief moment those pictures made me question whether he had truly found the success he always wanted. However, the more I focused on my own progress, the less those images affected me, because I began understanding something important: the life he displayed was based on appearances, while the life I was building was based on effort and independence. Slowly, that realization helped me regain the confidence I had lost during the breakup. I stopped comparing my journey with the glamorous world he seemed to enjoy and instead concentrated on the goals that mattered to me. My work continued improving, and the projects I handled started receiving recognition from colleagues and supervisors who appreciated the consistency and dedication I brought to every challenge outside of work. I also developed new routines that strengthened my sense of balance: long walks through the city parks, quiet evenings, reading and planning the next steps of my career. These simple habits created a peaceful rhythm that allowed me to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment or regret. As time passed, the memory of the breakup slowly transformed from a painful wound into a lesson about values and priorities. I realized that the person who left had simply revealed what mattered most to him, and that knowledge allowed me to stop questioning the decision he made. One evening, while finishing a long day at work, I received a message from an old friend who occasionally kept up with people from our social circle. The message mentioned something unexpected about Mark and the life he had chosen. Although it did not include many details, the tone suggested that things might not be as perfect as they once appeared. Reading those words made me pause for a moment, because the glamorous image he had presented for so long suddenly seemed less certain. I did not yet know what had happened or how serious the situation might be, but the idea that his perfect life could be facing problems created a quiet sense of curiosity in my mind. And as I looked out at the city lights glowing across the Chicago skyline, I realized that sometimes the paths people chase in search of success can lead them into situations far more complicated than the ones they left behind. As the months turned into years, my life in Chicago slowly began transforming into something stronger and more stable than I had ever imagined. During the painful days after the breakup, the energy I once spent Thinking about the past was now fully directed toward building my future. My work continued improving, and the dedication I had invested in my career finally began producing visible results. Projects I managed started receiving recognition within the company, and opportunities for greater responsibility appeared in ways that made me realize how much I had grown through persistence and patience. Every success, no matter how small, reminded me that the life I was building was truly my own, something shaped by effort rather than circumstances created by someone else. This realization brought a sense of confidence that I had never fully experienced before, because it showed me that the independence I once feared was actually the foundation of my strength outside of work. I also began reconnecting with parts of life that I had neglected during the relationship with Mark. Friendships became deeper, evenings were filled with meaningful conversations, and the city that once felt lonely after the breakup now felt full of possibilities. Chicago, with its endless streets and vibrant energy, slowly became a symbol of the new chapter I was creating. Meanwhile, occasional updates about Mark continued reaching me through friends and social circles. At first, those updates still carried the same glamorous tone, describing luxury events, expensive trips, and the lifestyle he once dreamed about. But over time, the tone of those conversations began changing in subtle ways. Rumors started appearing about tensions within his new relationship. People mentioned disagreements about finances, expectations, and the pressure that often comes with maintaining a lifestyle built around wealth and status. At first, these stories sounded vague, almost like speculation, yet the more often they appeared, the clearer it became that something was shifting behind the scenes. The perfect image Mark once presented to the world seemed to be developing small cracks that were difficult to hide completely. One evening, while meeting a friend for coffee near the river, I heard a more detailed update that made the situation even more surprising. Apparently, the life Mark had entered was not as secure as it looked from the outside. Many of the luxuries he enjoyed were tied directly to the wealth of the woman he had chosen, and the relationship itself carried expectations that were far more complicated than he originally imagined. Maintaining that lifestyle required constant appearances, social events, and financial pressures that slowly created tension between them. Hearing this information did not bring me satisfaction or revenge, but it did create a quiet realization in my mind. The life he once believed was better than the one we planned together had its own challenges that money alone could not solve. At the same time, my own life continued moving steadily forward. A promotion at work brought new responsibilities and recognition that strengthened my confidence even further. Colleagues respected my dedication, and the stability I had built allowed me to plan long-term goals with optimism rather than uncertainty. The contrast between these two paths became more visible with each passing month. The person who once left to chase a richer life was now facing complications that came with that choice, while the person who was left behind had quietly built something strong through patience and effort. Eventually, another surprising update reached me through our shared social circle. The relationship Mark had once displayed as perfect was now facing serious problems. The pressure of maintaining appearances, financial expectations, and personal differences had created conflicts that could no longer remain hidden. The glamorous photographs and public celebrations that once filled social media had become rare, replaced by silence and speculation about what was really happening behind the scenes. Hearing this news did not change the direction of my life, but it confirmed something I had begun to understand long ago. Success and happiness cannot be measured by the wealth someone appears to have, because the life that looks perfect from a distance may be far more fragile than anyone realizes. And as I stood looking out over the lights reflecting on the Chicago River that evening, I felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that the path I had chosen through patience and independence was leading me toward a future that no longer depended on anyone who once believed money was the only measure of a better life. As time continued moving forward, my life became busier with responsibilities, opportunities, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful through steady effort. The promotion I received at work opened doors to larger projects and new professional Connections that allowed me to grow even more confident in my abilities. The long hours I once spent rebuilding my life after the breakup now felt like an investment that was finally returning results. Each success reminded me how much stronger I had become since the moment Mark walked away, believing he had chosen a better future. Meanwhile, the occasional updates about his life continued reaching me. Through shared acquaintances and the stories that once sounded glamorous now carried a very different tone, the relationship that appeared perfect on social media had gradually begun falling apart. The lifestyle built around wealth and luxury brought expectations that neither of them seemed able to maintain. Disagreements about money, appearances, and priorities slowly created tension that could no longer remain hidden. The same world of expensive events and high-status connections that once looked exciting had apparently become a source of constant pressure for Mark, because maintaining that image required more than he originally imagined. Many of the things he proudly displayed during the early years of the relationship were never truly his. They belonged to the environment he entered, rather than the life he built himself. Hearing these details made me realize that the perfect life he once showed to everyone had always been more fragile than it appeared. While these changes were happening in his world, my own life continued growing in ways that felt calm and genuine. I had moved into a new apartment closer to the center of Chicago, a place that represented the stability I had created through years of dedication. The city that once witnessed my lowest moments now felt like the place where I had quietly rebuilt everything I believed in. One afternoon, while attending a professional networking event connected to my company, I experienced something completely unexpected. The event took place in a large downtown building where professionals from different industries gathered to exchange ideas and opportunities. The room was filled with conversation and movement as people introduced themselves and discussed their work. While speaking with colleagues near one of the conference tables, I suddenly noticed a familiar figure standing across the room. For a moment, I wondered if I was mistaken because the person looked different from the confident man I remembered, but after a few seconds, the recognition became clear. It was Mark. Seeing him there felt surreal because the last image I carried of him was from the day he left, convinced that a richer life was waiting somewhere else. Now he stood in the same room, surrounded by people who had built their success through effort rather than status, and the difference between our paths suddenly became very real. He eventually noticed me as well, and the surprise on his face was impossible to hide. The confident expression he once carried had been replaced by hesitation, as if he was unsure how to react to seeing the person he once walked away from. Our brief interaction during that event revealed more than any long conversation could have. His appearance and demeanor suggested that life had not followed the effortless path he once imagined. The luxurious world he chose had clearly brought complications, and the certainty he once had about his decisions seemed far less strong now. While we exchanged polite greetings, the contrast between our lives was quietly visible. I stood there representing the stability and independence I had built through years of hard work, while he seemed to carry the weight of choices that had not produced the success he expected. The moment lasted only a few minutes before we returned to our separate conversations, yet as I continued speaking with colleagues and participating in the event, I realized that the person who once believed money would lead him to a better life was now standing face to face with the reality that the woman he left behind had quietly created a future far stronger than the one he chose to chase. And the expression on his face made it clear that he understood that truth, even if no words were spoken about it at all. After the unexpected encounter at the networking event, the rest of the evening passed with a quiet sense of reflection in my mind. Seeing Mark again after so many years felt like looking at a distant chapter of my life that no longer had power over my future. The person I once depended on emotionally was now simply someone from the past whose choices had led him down a very different road from the one I had taken. After the event ended and people slowly began leaving the building, I stepped outside into the cool Chicago evening. The city lights reflected across the streets, and for a moment I thought about How much had changed since the day Mark walked away believing that wealth and status would bring him a better life. Not long after that encounter, he reached out asking if we could talk. The request surprised me, but it also confirmed what I had sensed during those few minutes at the event. The confidence he once carried about his decision had clearly faded. We eventually met for a brief conversation in a quiet public place where the atmosphere allowed both of us to speak calmly about the years that had passed. Mark admitted that the life he once believed would guarantee happiness had not turned out the way he imagined. The relationship that looked perfect from the outside had slowly collapsed under pressure, expectations, and conflicts that he had never anticipated. The luxurious world he entered brought advantages, but it also came with conditions that constantly reminded him that the life he was living did not truly belong to him. Hearing him explain this did not bring me anger or satisfaction, because the emotions that once defined our breakup had already faded with time. Instead, I listened with a sense of distance, realizing that the person he had become was very different from the man I once loved. He eventually spoke about the path my life seemed to have taken, mentioning the success I had built through work and dedication, the independence I had developed during the years after the breakup, and the stability that now surrounded my future. His tone carried a quiet regret, because the person he once left behind had created exactly the kind of life he claimed would never be enough for him. Years earlier, he suggested that perhaps things could have been different if we had stayed together, but by that point I understood something important. The past cannot be rebuilt simply because someone realizes their mistake. My life had moved forward through challenges, lessons, and growth that shaped the person I had become, and returning to the relationship that once ended so suddenly would only reopen a chapter that had already taught me everything it needed to teach. With calm honesty, I explained that the years apart had helped me discover my own strength and independence. The breakup that once felt like a painful loss had eventually become the reason I learned how to rely on myself and build a future without depending on someone else's choices. That once hurt me had ultimately pushed me toward opportunities I might never have pursued otherwise. Hearing those words seemed to make Mark realize that the story between us had truly reached its ending. He respected the decision, even though the expression on his face revealed the weight of understanding what had been lost. When we said goodbye and went our separate ways, the moment felt peaceful rather than dramatic, because there was nothing left to argue about. The life he once chose had taught him its own lessons, while the life I built through patience had given me confidence, clarity, and direction. As I walked through the city streets that evening, I realized that karma rarely appears through loud revenge or sudden punishment. Instead, it works quietly, allowing people to face the consequences of the priorities they choose. The man who once believed money defined a better life had discovered that wealth alone cannot replace loyalty, respect, and genuine connection, and the woman he once left behind had learned that true success comes from building a life strong enough that it never depends on someone who walks away when something richer appears.